They were Hollywood's golden boys, Robert Redford and Paul Newman, the effortlessly cool, blue-eyed duo who lit up the screen and redefined what it meant to have chemistry between co-stars. For decades, their bond was the stuff of cinematic legend, iconic films, whispered stories, mutual admiration. But behind the charm and charisma was a persistent rumor that trailed them quietly, like a shadow the cameras never caught. Now, at 89 years old, Robert Redford has finally broken his silence, and what he confirmed has stunned fans and insiders alike. After years of dodging the question with a wry smile or a quick deflection, Redford didn't just nod to the speculation. He gave it weight. Real, undeniable weight. His voice, aged but unwavering, carried something more than nostalgia. It carried truth. In a rare and deeply personal reflection, Redford opened up about his friendship with Newman in a way he never had before, peeling back the carefully maintained layers of Hollywood myth and revealing something surprisingly intimate. It wasn't a tabloid scandal. It wasn't a dirty secret, but it was real, and it mattered. And after all this time, Redford decided the world deserved to hear it, not for the drama, but for the legacy. As he put it, some things you only say when it's almost too late. So what was the rumor? Why now? And what does it change about how we remember the friendship, and possibly the love, that defined one of cinema's greatest pairings? Before Redford's quiet revelation stirred a fresh wave of speculation, their story was already the kind of Hollywood mythology that felt almost too perfect to be real. When Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid premiered in 1969, it didn't just launch one of the most beloved films of its era. It cemented Robert Redford and Paul Newman as a duo unlike anything audiences had ever seen. Their chemistry wasn't forced. It wasn't rehearsed. It was lightning in a bottle. One part rebellious charm, one part unspoken understanding, all wrapped in the kind of effortless masculinity that defined a generation. They weren't just acting, they were reacting to each other, building something authentic with every stolen glance and dry one-liner. From the moment they appeared on screen together, people didn't just admire them, they believed them. And that belief followed them into The Sting just 4 years later, where their reunion only fueled the growing perception that what they had went beyond the screen. It was playful. It was intimate. It was, to some, even romantic. And yet, both men, known for their private lives and quiet dignity, never publicly fed into that narrative. They kept their bond sacred, untouched by tabloids and untainted by speculation. Behind the scenes, stories circulated about their deep loyalty to one another. Newman reportedly insisted that Redford be cast in Butch Cassidy, even when the studio hesitated. They took pay cuts for each other. They turned down roles unless both could be involved. And yet, they never collaborated again after The Sting. It wasn't due to a falling out. There was no scandal, no feud, no dramatic tabloid headline. Just silence. And that silence only added to the intrigue. Friends described them as fiercely protective of each other, often finishing one another's sentences or sharing private jokes in crowded rooms. Newman once said, "The friendship we had, it just was. I don't know how else to put it." And Redford, when asked why they didn't reunite later in life, famously quipped, "Some things are perfect the way they were." But now, in the quiet twilight of his life, Redford seems to feel differently. Perhaps with Newman gone, and the weight of years making certain things harder to carry, he's finally ready to let the world into that rare and complicated bond they shared. And with just a few words, he's changed the story we thought we knew. For decades, the rumor lingered like perfume in a room long after its subject had gone, subtle, persistent, and impossible to ignore. It was never shouted from the headlines, but always there, whispered in interviews, speculated about in fan forums, and occasionally hinted at by journalists brave enough to risk the raised eyebrows of Hollywood's old guard. What exactly was going on between Robert Redford and Paul Newman behind closed doors? The talk began, unsurprisingly, during the press tour for Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Reporters noticed the way Redford and Newman looked at each other, not as actors performing camaraderie, but as men who seemed to genuinely enjoy, even depend on, one another's presence. The banter was easy, the laughter real, the affection unmistakable. They act like they've known each other forever. One journalist wrote at the time, like they don't have to speak out loud to be heard. Of course, the 1970s were not an era that welcomed nuance in male relationships. Close friendships between famous men were either flattened into macho alliances or spun into scandal. And for two stars so famously private and so devastatingly handsome, their closeness invited a level of projection that neither man seemed interested in correcting. That silence only made the whispers grow louder. The rumors ranged in tone, some sweet, others salacious. Some said Newman had once confessed deep feelings for Redford after too many drinks at a rap party. Others claimed it was Redford who, in a vulnerable moment, once referred to Newman as the one who got away. There were stories about vacations taken without their wives, nights spent talking until dawn, letters exchanged and never shown to the public. Was it love? Was it loyalty? Was it just the kind of friendship most men are too afraid to admit they need? Neither actor ever directly addressed the speculation. They dodged, deflected, joked. Newman, always quick with a dry quip, once told a reporter, "Bob's the only man I'd leave my wife for, but don't print that." Redford, characteristically more restrained, would simply smile and say, "Paul was my partner in crime. That's all you need to know." But of course, it wasn't all we needed to know. Fans wanted more. Not out of voyeurism, but because we saw something in them that felt rare. A closeness that refused to be reduced to labels. A bond that felt too profound for platonic, too protected for public display. The rumor wasn't just about whether Redford and Newman were more than friends. It was about the possibility that two Hollywood icons, in an era dominated by ego and image, had something deeper, quieter, and maybe even more meaningful than love stories scripted on a page. And now, in the final chapter of his life, Redford has confirmed that part of the rumor, at least one part of it, was true. But what part? And why speak now, after all this time? The moment it happened, it didn't feel like a headline. It felt like a confession. In a soft-spoken, almost offhand comment during a recent sit-down for a retrospective documentary on the golden age of American cinema, Robert Redford, now 89, with a voice that carries the weight of nearly a century, let the words slip with no theatrics, no pause for reaction. Just truth. Quiet. Understated. Devastatingly clear. They always asked about Paul, he said, eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the camera. And I always said we were just friends. But the truth is, I loved him. Not just as a friend, something more, I think. I just never had the courage to say it then. There it was. A single sentence that rewrote decades of speculation, subtext, and rumor into something far more intimate. It wasn't a scandal. It wasn't gossip. It was loss. And longing. The kind of admission that only comes when a man has nothing left to prove and everything to let go of. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. There was a long silence after the statement, and the interviewer, clearly caught off guard, chose not to press him. Perhaps out of respect. Perhaps out of disbelief. Or maybe because in that moment, everyone understood the magnitude of what had just been said. It was a window into a chapter that had been kept closed not out of shame, but out of preservation. Redford hadn't denied the rumor to deceive anyone. He had done it to protect something he wasn't ready to name. Until now. The admission sent quiet shockwaves through the industry, not because it confirmed decades of speculation, but because of how gently, how humanly, it reframed the narrative. It wasn't about labeling the relationship. It wasn't about whether something happened in the way people wanted to imagine. It was about acknowledging a connection that defied the language Hollywood and society was ever equipped to handle, and perhaps still isn't. For years, Redford had spoken of Newman with reverence. He called him the brother I never had, the man who made me better, and the only actor I never had to act with. But this was different. This was raw. This was real. And it brought a new kind of ache to their story, because it wasn't just about what they shared, but about what they never allowed themselves to fully explore. Fans immediately began revisiting old interviews, reading between the lines, watching their films through new eyes. The stolen glances in Butch Cassidy, the unspoken trust in the sting, the genuine joy when the other laughed, it was all still there. But now, it carried new weight. This wasn't about scandal or sensationalism. It was about two men who found something in each other that went beyond explanation, beyond timing, even beyond bravery. And in the quiet twilight of his life, Redford chose to let the truth rise. Not for attention, but because sometimes the deepest truths are the ones we carry the longest. Why now? It's the question everyone asked the moment Robert Redford let those words slip, words that had been sitting quietly, almost invisibly, behind 5 decades of silence. Why wait until 89, when the spotlight has faded, when his closest confidant is no longer here to share the moment or respond to it? The answer, in some ways, says more about Redford than the confession itself. For all his fame, Redford has always been a man who chose restraint over revelation. He's lived a life just outside the glare of gossip, shunning the confessional interviews and red carpet oversharing that defined so many of his contemporaries. In an industry that rewards emotional exposure, Redford built his legend on privacy. He was the quiet storm, the grounded ideal, the man who let his work speak, but never quite spoke back. So to finally speak now, at the very edge of his own story, feels deliberate, not dramatic, not performative, necessary. Sources close to the actor say that Redford has grown more reflective in recent years, less focused on the image, more concerned with the legacy. Not just the public one, but the private one. The stories untold. The truths he kept to himself out of fear, loyalty, or simply the sense that some things weren't meant to be said aloud. But time does something to a person. It peels back those old rules, and the walls we built to protect ourselves start to feel less like protection and more like prisons. There's also the aching reality. Newman is gone, and has been since 2008. Whatever space they shared, emotional, spiritual, or something in between, Redford now carries alone. Maybe that's why the silence finally felt unbearable. Not because he wanted the world to know, but because he needed to say it, to release it. Not for a headline, but for himself. In a rare interview years ago, when asked how he coped with Newman's passing, Redford paused for a long time before saying, "It's strange. The world talks about him as if he's a memory. But for me, he's not. He's a presence. Always will be." That's what makes this confession feel less like a reveal and more like a reckoning. A way to honor not just what was, but what wasn't. The words left unspoken between them, the feelings buried under loyalty, timing, and the sheer weight of who they were supposed to be. Because the truth is, in their era, 2 leading men at the peak of American cinema, there was no room for complexity. No space to explore anything beyond what the public wanted them to represent. And maybe Redford knew that. Maybe they both did. So they preserved it, protected it, and in doing so, may have sacrificed the chance to live it fully. Now, with nothing left to lose and so much to remember, Redford has chosen honesty. Not the tabloid kind, but the quiet, deeply human kind. The kind that comes only when the applause has faded, and all that's left is the truth you can no longer carry alone. The internet didn't explode, but it did hold its breath. In the hours after Robert Redford's quiet confession aired, the reaction wasn't outrage or shock. It was something far more powerful: recognition. Across social media, film forums, and fan accounts dedicated to classic Hollywood, the response was a mix of bittersweet acceptance, stunned reverence, and quiet mourning for something beautiful that had lived in the margins for too long. "He didn't say it for us," one commenter wrote on X, formerly Twitter. "He said it because he needed to." And somehow, that makes it even more profound. Within hours, old clips of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and The Sting were trending again, not because of nostalgia, but because people were watching differently now. That wink, that smile, that too long pause between lines, it all looked different in the light of Redford's words. The performances hadn't changed, but our understanding had. And in that shift, 1,000 quiet truths found their place. Longtime fans who had always felt there was something more between the two icons began sharing their memories. Old interviews, grainy behind-the-scenes footage, and quotes that suddenly carried more weight. Younger viewers, many of whom had only discovered their films through streaming, began asking new questions. How many stories like this have we missed? How many icons lived quietly with truths they never felt allowed to speak? Queer audiences, in particular, responded with a mix of validation and heartbreak. For years, the idea that Newman and Redford's connection might have gone deeper was treated as subtext at best, fantasy at worst. Now, Redford's words gave space to a different interpretation, not one that demands a label, but one that affirms the emotional legitimacy of what so many had felt but been told not to believe. He didn't need to say, "I was in love with him" or "we were together," one Tumblr user posted. He said he loved him, and that's enough. That's everything. There was no viral scandal, no backlash. Just a wave of respect for Redford's courage, for Newman's memory, and for a kind of love that doesn't fit easily into categories. Film critics weighed in, calling the moment a cultural reset for how we view old Hollywood masculinity. Others wrote long essays about the tenderness men were once denied and the cost of maintaining emotional silence for the sake of legacy. Even fellow actors began responding, mostly with quiet solidarity. One prominent A-list star, who asked not to be named, told a reporter, "That kind of love, the kind that stays unspoken for a lifetime, that's not weakness. That's strength most of us will never understand." In a world where headlines often scream, Redford's soft-spoken truth was a whisper that echoed louder. It didn't demand attention. It deserved it. And in that stillness, fans, both old and new, found a piece of themselves in a story that was never about gossip. It was about grief and love, and what happens when someone finally says the thing they've held in for far too long. When Robert Redford finally said it, really said it, it wasn't about rewriting history. It was about reclaiming it, not with fanfare or scandal, but with the quiet gravity of a man who has lived long enough to understand the value of the things he never said. That single sentence, "I loved him," not just as a friend, something more, I think, didn't just confirm a rumor. It reframed a legacy. We started with a question: what was the truth behind Robert Redford and Paul Newman's bond? And we end with an answer that resists definition, but pulses with emotional clarity. It wasn't about labels. It wasn't about revelations that fit neatly into headlines. It was about love in its most elusive form, the kind that's felt deeply, lived quietly, and finally spoken. Too late to change the past, but just in time to change how it's remembered. Their friendship, once mythologized as the ultimate male camaraderie, now carries a different kind of tenderness. A longing, a truth that maybe even they didn't fully understand at the time. But Redford understands it now. And in saying it, he didn't just honor Newman. He freed a part of himself that had been held still for half a century. It's rare for Hollywood legends to surprise us in their final chapters. Most stories fade out, but Redford's didn't. Instead, he offered a final scene, quiet, raw, achingly human, that reframes everything that came before. And in doing so, he reminded us that even the most iconic stories are never really finished. Because sometimes, the last thing you say becomes the truest thing you ever said.